In a city where wealth buys silence but not sleep, one gentle-hearted barista meets two men who seem to own the night. What begins with a spilled latte and a forgotten umbrella becomes a love that outgrows penthouses, rumors, and fear, restoring faith in ordinary, extraordinary hearts. Against brave expectations. Stay with me, subscribe, and share this story. Your support helps caring voices thrive and keeps heartfelt tales reaching everyone. If you're watching this on a quiet evening, maybe with the television humming low in the other room and a cup of tea cooling by your elbow, I want you to feel welcome here. This is a story about people, not perfect people. People with routines, opinions, and a few stubborn habits. People who've built big lives and people who've learned to love small ones. It's about two rich men and one gay man who thought his life would always be one step behind the rest. It's about the way love sounds when it isn't trying to impress anyone. About the courage it takes to sit with the truth, and about how a city almost forgot what a neighborhood could feel like, until someone remembered. We begin on a cold Chicago morning that arrived exactly on time the way winter always does, shrugging its shoulders and asking you to pull your scarf a little tighter. The lake was the color of tin. The wind was blunt but not cruel. And in a little corner cafe 2 blocks from the museum and 3 doors down from a senior center, a man named Jonah wiped down a spill he'd made with a cinnamon shaker that had decided to surprise him. "Sorry about that," he said to the woman at the counter, her earrings sparkling under the cafe lights. "I'd blame the shaker, but I've learned not to blame tools for human enthusiasm." She laughed, and he smiled with that kind of sincere apology that calms rather than excuses. That was Jonah. He was the sort of person who noticed when someone's coat had a loose button, who refilled table water without making a show of it, who remembered the regulars' names and stories. He had a quiet pride about him, the kind that comes from choosing to be kind even when you're tired. And he had the busy kind of heart that knew the schedules of the senior center next door almost better than his own. He'd help Evelyn with her email when the settings got confusing. He'd read the newspaper to Mr. Palladino, who liked to grumble at every headline at least twice. He'd leave a thermos of soup on the counter for Gloria when her shift ran late at the pharmacy. That was Jonah, broke only in the way most of us are. In need of more hours, more patience, and the occasional nudge to believe he deserved better. The bell above the cafe door chimed. In came a man with a coat that said in a whisper, "You can trust me with the weather." He was tall, with dark hair he wore like he'd paid for a haircut that came with a cup of coffee and a story. He glanced around and Jonah felt the room shift. Not because the man was handsome, though he was, but because he seemed to carry quiet with him, the way some people carry confidence. He walked to the counter, his steps unhurried, and looked up at the menu, even though people like him probably had someone to look at menus for them. "Good morning," Jonah said. Friendly, but not eager. He never wanted to push anyone to be friendlier than they felt. "Morning," the man replied. "What's your recommendation? Today?" "The cinnamon latte is being dramatic, but when it behaves, it's quite good." "I like when things are a bit dramatic," the man said with a smile that didn't rush to prove anything. "Cinnamon latte it is?" Jonah worked quickly, hands sure, mind steady. The milk swirled, the foam rose, and the cinnamon did its dance the way beloved spices do. He handed over the cup, ready to move forward, when the man shifted his grip to hold the door for an older couple coming in. In that brief moment, one glove caught the lid, and the latte tilted just enough to slip. Foam met cashmere. Jonah's face registered the spill before the cup finished falling, and he reached for napkins already. "I am so sorry," he said, and meant it. "It's a sweater," the man said. Not bothered at all, and it's warm now. "An upgrade." They both laughed. Not a big laugh, but big enough to fix the thing that was fixable, the awkwardness. Jonah wiped down the counter and the edge of the sleeve with gentle efficiency. The man watched him with the kind of attention reserved for people who know how to fix small messes without turning them into tragedies. "I can comp your drink," Jonah offered. "Please don't," the man said. "Let me pay for the theater." "And," he glanced down at his coat pocket, "apparently I've brought an umbrella to the cafe because I am that sort of optimist." He left the umbrella on the counter as he paid, then moved toward the window seat. where he sat not to be seen but to see. Outside, a cyclist passed with a scarf streaming like a banner. Inside, the hum of conversation found its rhythm again. Jonah took a breath. There are people who leave a room warmer the way a heater does, and there are people who change the temperature the way a window opens. This man, whoever he was, seemed to be both. After the morning rush, Jonah noticed the umbrella still resting where the man had left it. He glanced to the window. The man was gone. Jonah picked up the umbrella, something about its weight and the grace of its handle, telling him this belonged to a person who appreciated sturdy, beautiful things. He tucked it behind the counter where he kept lost items and found hopes. That afternoon, after the cafe closed for an hour before dinner service, Jonah stepped next door into the senior center with 2 boxes of donated art supplies. He had promised to help set up for Evelyn's watercolor class. The room smelled faintly of lemons and old paper, the way many comforting places do. He placed brushes in mason jars and set little folded towels beside each station. On a table in the back, a jar held slips of paper with prompts. "Paint a place you loved when you were young," one said. Another, "Paint a moment you didn't realize you were happy until later." Evelyn, a woman whose posture had aged more gracefully than most wine, walked in with her hair pinned in a practical bun. "Jonah, darling," she said, "if you keep being this helpful, we'll have to name the supply closet after you." "I can't think of a greater honor," Jonah replied. "Well, maybe just a slightly better stocked closet." "We're working on it," Evelyn said with a conspiratorial wink. "There's a gentleman here today who's new. He says he used to doodle in the margins of board meeting agendas. That's got to be a start." "We'll make an artist out of him yet," Jonah said. "You already know who the new gentleman was." He arrived quietly, a soft smile on his face when he looked at the jars of brushes, the tiny bowls of water, the old radio in the corner playing a tune that swayed. He wore a different coat and a different sweater, but it was unmistakably him. "Hi," Jonah said, trying not to act like he recognized him. "Welcome. Thank you," the man replied. "I'm Matthew." "Jonah," he offered. "It's nice to meet you, again." Matthew's brows lifted, and then he smiled with the recognition. "Ah, the latte that wanted to be a sweater. And the umbrella that wanted to be adopted," Jonah said. He nodded toward the umbrella that now rested by the door, where he'd brought it just in case. "We kept it safe." "You saved its dignity," Matthew said. He looked around the room, the tables lined with paper, the gentle light from the windows. "This is beautiful." "It's not fancy," Jonah said, and then immediately wished he'd used a kinder word. "People apologize too quickly for places that didn't look expensive." "It's grounded," Matthew said, as if correcting the mood rather than the word. "I like that." If you've lived long enough, and I believe you have, you know that some conversations begin with words and some with an atmosphere. Matthew and Jonah didn't start with flirtation. They began with the soft practice of being useful next to each other. Evelyn paired them at a table and gave them each a brush. "We're painting places we loved when we were young," she said. Jonah painted the backyard of his aunt's house, the one with the crooked lilac bush that used to attract bumblebees so fat you worried they wouldn't fit back into the air. He painted the way the concrete would warm your palms in summer, the way your bare feet would carry tiny pebbles into the kitchen and leave your mother sighing but smiling. Matthew painted the public library he used to visit on Saturdays with his mom. Before Saturdays became business opportunities, he painted the wonder of spines lined like 100 careful soldiers, the smell of dust and daydreams, the way sunlight through tall windows would slant across the carpet and make a stage for his imagination. "Your lines are steady," Jonah said quietly. "I spent a lot of time pretending bookshelves were ships," Matthew replied. "Maybe I practiced steering." They laughed. The kind of laugh people enjoy when they recognize the child still living somewhere under their adult schedules. Before the class ended, a murmured conversation drifted down the hall. The senior center director, a woman named Teresa with a tone that could both soothe and persuade, was walking with someone whose voice carried money. Not just a person with a lot of it, but a person used to organizing it. "I understand the timeline," Teresa said carefully, "but this center is essential. There are faces attached to those deadlines." "We're not closing off options," the man replied. We're evaluating potential. We have to consider the footprint and long-term sustainability. In the corner, Evelyn met Jonah's eyes and made a small face that meant, here it is, the thing we've been worried about. The building had been reveling in its character for a long time, but character doesn't patch pipes or repair roofs. There had been rumors about a redevelopment plan. Jonah had heard whispers of mixed use with more enthusiasm than detail. He felt a knot in his stomach quietly form, the way you feel a storm before it rains. Matthew paid attention without intruding. He took in the room, the art, the human pace of it. And if you were very observant, you might have seen his jaw tighten a fraction. The way good people sometimes realize they've been looking at a puzzle from a comfortable distance and suddenly see a missing piece. When class ended, Matthew returned the umbrella to Jonah with a slight flourish. "Rescued and returned," he said. "Thank you." "You can borrow it any time," Jonah said, then glanced at the door where Teresa and the well-dressed man had disappeared. "You coming next week?" "If there's a class next week," Matthew said, because he had always known that money could move walls quietly. "There'll be a class," Evelyn said from behind them, her voice full of the kind of dogged hope that builds entire community centers from one potluck and 2 petitions. "Trust me, we're still here." Matthew dipped his head respectfully. "I'll be here." He did come back the next week, and the week after that, and the week after that. He never made a show of it. He was the sort of rich man who had learned that attention can be an accident with a long tail. He kept his voice modest and his schedule open for a 2-hour watercolor class that had, quickly and unexpectedly, begun to feel important. And Jonah, who had learned to meet kindnesses with acceptance rather than suspicion, grew used to the sight of Matthew's careful hands holding a brush like something both fragile and strong. We tend to believe our stories turn on a single dramatic moment, and sometimes they do, but more often stories bend around small, ordinary choices. Matthew started showing up early to help set the tables. Jonah started saving an extra seat at the cafe window on Saturday afternoons. They would sit and watch the neighborhood do what neighborhoods do, people carrying groceries, hands in pockets, someone walking a dog that walked them. They talked about recipes and patience, about the sound of lake waves on windy nights, about their families. "I was raised by a mom who loved crossword puzzles and told me money could protect you from cold but not from loneliness," Matthew said. "My grandmother used to say money was a tool, not a score," Jonah replied. "I liked that. A hammer is only as good as what it builds." Matthew smiled at that. He didn't hide the fact that he was wealthy. He also didn't lead with it. He talked about the first time he signed his name to a lease without help, how proud he was to buy a bed that didn't squeak without asking for a favor. Jonah talked about the pride of buying boots that didn't blister and a winter coat that held up after 3 winters. Different victories, same feeling, I did that. I made a life that could stand in wind and not fall over. One evening, as the sky turned a gentle bruised purple, Matthew asked Jonah if he'd like to see the city from higher up. "I know a place," he said. He didn't say it with the swagger of a man showing off. He said it like a person offering a quiet miracle. He led Jonah to a building most people only ever saw from the street. They passed through a lobby that smelled faintly of polished stone and eucalyptus. An elevator delivered them to a rooftop garden with planters built like piano keys and benches that remembered countless conversations. The city's light stretched, steady and human. The wind softened, as if it remembered it had other places to be rough and could be kind here. Matthew watched the view, not Jonah, when he began to speak. "I've spent a lot of years learning how to be responsible with money," he said. "It's harder than people think. Not because math is hard, because priorities are slippery. It's easy to convince yourself you're doing the right thing when everyone around you has the same reasons. It helps to have someone who will ask you about people, not plans. Not profits, people." Jonah let the silence hold the truth rather than filling it. "I'll ask about people," he said, because it seemed like a promise worth making to a man who was practicing telling the truth. Not just facts, but the kind of truth that changes what you do next. The first snow fell the following week. It rendered the city into black, white, and 100 shades of gray that made everything feel like a photograph. The senior center stayed open late, so no one had to walk home alone on slick sidewalks. Jonah made cocoa. Matthew helped salt the steps. They stood by the window for a minute, watching the street glow under a street lamp. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Jonah asked. "Chicago?" Matthew said. "Sometimes. Then I think about how the city looks at me, tough but fair, and I stay." Jonah nodded with a smile. "The city does have that look." "Do you ever think about changing jobs?" Matthew asked gently. "All the time," Jonah admitted. "Then I think about the way Mrs. Lee smiles when she tastes the first sip of her tea with exactly 2 lemon wedges, and I stay." "Seems like we both stay for the right reasons," Matthew said. "There's a particular sweetness that comes from learning someone's rhythms, where they reach for a glass, how they tie their shoes, the words they save for serious things." Jonah learned that Matthew would always check his phone twice before putting it away, not out of obsession, but habit. Matthew learned that Jonah hummed when he measured spices, a little under his breath tune that might have been a memory. They learned that they both liked Sunday mornings slow and honest. They learned to make space for each other's quiet. Of course, a story like this does not move in a straight line up toward perfect. There was a day the line dipped and tried to see if it could break them. It began with a headline. You know the kind, a photograph in slightly harsh lighting, a bold font, a lot of declarations, and few questions. The headline said that the Ellington Group, owned by a board that included a Mr. Victor Ellington, Matthew's uncle, and a couple of other rich men who sat on more boards than most people have coffee mugs, was moving forward with a redevelopment that would reimagine a certain block of the neighborhood. The illustrations showed trees and smiling people and did not show the building they planned to remove, the senior center. Jonah found out the way many of us do. A friend texted him a link with a message that said, "Isn't this your place?" He clicked. His stomach dropped. He felt heat in his face that had nothing to do with weather. He knew enough to know press releases are a version of the truth. But this version erased people he loved. He called Teresa. "We were told this was exploratory," she said, her voice steady but carrying the thickness of a whole day spent keeping other people calm. "Apparently it's exploring very fast." He called Evelyn. "We've fought for things before," she said. Because she was 76 and remembered that people could outlast even the most sure-sounding plans. "We can fight for this." He called Matthew. Matthew was already on his way. They met at the cafe, the afternoon light struggling to keep its hold on the street. Jonah's eyes were clearer than his voice when he said, "I need to know what you knew." Matthew didn't flinch. He had spent enough time learning to answer questions clearly. "I knew the Ellington Group was considering redevelopment," he said. "I didn't know the senior center was in the plan. I sit on a philanthropic board with 2 of the principals, but I am not a partner. I found out about the final plan this morning. I called my uncle. He told me it was a community opportunity. I told him we have different definitions of community." Jonah listened. He wanted to believe him. He did. But the headline was loud and he felt protective of his people. He started, then stopped, tightened his jaw, and tried again. "It's not just a building, you know that." "I do," Matthew said, quietly like someone speaking in a church. "I do, Jonah." Something in Jonah that had been bracing for a fight softened. "I know you're not your uncle." "I'm also not useless," Matthew added, not defensively but with resolve. "Let me work." The next week, their time was a blur of meetings and phone calls, city council hearings, a petition that reached 1,000 signatures before the ink on the first page was dry. Jonah printed flyers and handed them out until his fingers were smudged with ink and determination. Matthew called people he hadn't spoken to in years, and people he'd spoken to every other day, and said things you only say if you intend to stand behind them later. He also introduced Jonah to 2 of his friends, both wealthy and both well-known in the city for running businesses that kept their humanity. One was a man named Jasper, who ran a design firm that built public spaces with the kind of thoughtfulness that made you linger. The other was a man named Harris, who had made his money in textiles and then spent his later years turning old factories into artists. Studios that you could rent for less than the cost of lunch in the Loop. Rich men aren't a single species, Harris said, setting down a folder full of budgets that actually balanced. But we all face the temptation to move faster than the community can breathe. That's where we need friends who remind us how lungs work. These lungs, Jasper added, tapping the papers, breathe because they have people like you, he said to Jonah. Keep telling the stories. We'll bring the maps. And Matthew, he turned gently toward the younger man. You bring the stubborn. Matthew nodded. I can do stubborn. They developed an alternative plan that would save the senior center and even secure its future. It involved a community land trust, an arrangement that would take the building off the private market, put it into a trust stewarded by a board with representation from the seniors, the neighborhood, and the philanthropic group. It would create an endowment for repairs, and it would commit to funding arts programs, not just because they were nice, but because they were necessary for the kind of health that doesn't fit neatly in a medical chart. The meeting with the Ellington Group was held in a conference room that tried very hard to remind everyone that glass walls are transparent and therefore honest. You know the kind of room: polished table, bottled water, chairs that make you sit a little too straight. Matthew sat on one side with Jasper and Harris. Across from them were Victor, his uncle, a man whose cufflinks were the only sentimental thing about him, and two other executives whose shoes cost more than some people's rent. Victor spoke first. We have obligations, he said, as if anyone in the room had ever tried to ignore theirs. We have investors. We have permits pending. We have momentum. You also have a community, Matthew replied evenly. You have elders who built this city when it needed building. You have artists who hold space for the rest of us when we don't know how. You have Jonah. Victor looked at Jonah as if considering the novelty of being addressed by his first name. I admire your commitment, he said. Truly. But we have to think bigger. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He did something more dangerous. He told the truth slowly. Thinking big without thinking close is how we lose the things that make us human, he said. If you move the senior center, you're not just moving a program. You're moving relationships. You're moving the routine that keeps people alive, even if it doesn't look like medicine. You talk about return on investment. I'm asking you to consider what we're investing in. If we're building homes that don't know their neighbors, we're not building anything, we're staging. There was a pause. Not a silent one, but a thinking one. Jasper slid the proposal across the table. Harris added a financial forecast that couldn't be dismissed as sentimental, because the numbers spoke the language executives understood: prudent risk, sustainable returns, a reduction in legal fees simply by avoiding a public relations disaster that would cost them more than any redesign. Victor, who had never met a delay he liked, frowned as if trying to rearrange his own thoughts. A trust, he said, skeptical and intrigued. We'd be accepting a different kind of asset. You'd be accepting a different kind of legacy, Matthew said. He wasn't begging. He was explaining. The kind that outlasts our names. The room took a breath. Outside, the city carried on, car horns and crosswalks and someone running because they were late to a meeting like this one. Finally, one of the executives who had remained quiet the whole time cleared his throat. We could pilot this, he said. On a small scale. We are not a pilot, Jonah said softly, and for the first time, Victor looked at him as a man speaking on equal terms rather than a problem to be managed. Let's revise, Victor said at last. Let's see if we can make your numbers and our numbers agree. Negotiations are not love stories, but they contain love when people keep showing up. Weeks of back and forth made everyone tired and slightly sharper than usual. But slowly, like a good stew, something developed that felt like real nourishment. The trust structure took shape. The senior center would stay. The redeveloped block would include affordable studios and a small park named after Teresa's late husband, who had organized the first neighborhood cleanup 30 years ago. The morning they signed the agreement, Jonah stood outside the senior center and watched as a group of elders came down the steps like champions leaving a podium. Evelyn hugged him. You did it, she said. We did it, Jonah replied. All of us. The rich men, the not rich men, the persistent women, the patient attorneys, The print shop guy who discounted the flyers because he liked our font choice. The teenager who coded the petition site. The neighbor who brought sandwiches. Jonah, Evelyn said gently, placing a hand on his arm. You can share the credit, but don't give away your courage. He let that sink in. He looked over her shoulder and saw Matthew smiling in that quiet way of his, hands deep in his coat pockets, hair pushed back by the wind that always found him. They walked toward each other, not dramatically, not like a movie, but like two people who had been walking in the same direction for a while and finally reached the same corner at the same time. You did it, Matthew repeated. You saved a whole building and everything inside it. You did it with me, Jonah said. You could have stayed comfortable. You didn't? Matthew shrugged, the kind of shrug that admits the truth without bragging. Comfortable as a couch. This is a life. If this were a fairy tale, they would kiss in front of the building and fireworks would discreetly go off in the distance. But this wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. They stood close, the air deciding to be kind and not shove them apart. They looked each other in the eye and reached, one hand finding another, fingers warming in a shared pocket like a promise you don't rush to announce because you want to keep the joy close for a moment. Later, there was a celebration potluck at the center. Mrs. Lee brought dumplings. Teresa baked lasagna and pretended it was her grandmother's recipe, even though everyone knew it was the back of the box with a little too much love. Harris told a joke about accountants that made the accountants laugh and every artist groan. Jasper walked around with a sketchbook asking people to draw their favorite everyday objects. Matthew poured coffee and cut cake. Jonah moved through the room, making sure everyone had what they needed, and every time he looked across the room, Matthew was already looking back. After the plates were stacked and the last guest left, Jonah and Matthew walked down to the lake. Winter had loosened its grip. The water was still steel, but it had learned how to twinkle. They sat on a bench and let the bench do what benches are designed to do, hold people's weight without complaint. I won't pretend I don't have fears, Jonah said. Fears are honest, Matthew replied. They keep us asking good questions. I'm afraid of losing myself in someone else's life, Jonah admitted. I've worked hard to build something I like. It's modest. It's mine. I like my mornings. I like my evenings. And if we're together, Matthew said carefully, we make a life that keeps your mornings and your evenings. We make a third thing that doesn't eat the first two. Jonah smiled at that. A third thing, he repeated. That's a nice idea. It's more than an idea, Matthew said. It's a plan. I'm good at plans. We can keep loving our neighborhoods and our routines. We can take care of each other without reforming each other. We can have Tuesdays where we don't talk much and Saturdays where we talk all day. We can invite our friends, rich and not rich, into a circle that doesn't check net worth at the door, only kindness. Jonah reached out and touched Matthew's sleeve, not as a test, as a recognition. That's the only kind of door I want. Spring arrived like a well-earned apology from winter. The senior center's front garden sprouted tulips in colors that looked like they'd been boldly chosen by a grandmother who refused to be quiet. Jonah kept working at the cafe because he liked the way his hands knew what to do. Matthew kept working too, but something in the way he worked had shifted. He said no more often to projects that felt polished but hollow. He said yes to projects that took longer and promised less and made him sleep better. He gave himself the gift of slower mornings when he could, and a little less pressure to be understood by people who weren't interested in understanding him anyway. One Saturday, he took Jonah to meet his Uncle Victor at a fundraiser for a youth arts center. Jonah was nervous the way anyone is when they meet a person who has influenced someone they care about. Victor was charming and sharp, his conversation full of that particular rhythm of men who've gotten their way often enough to forget how to ask for it. But he surprised Jonah by asking questions and listening to the answers. You're the one who won that trust, Victor said, more impressed than he wanted to be. We all want it, Jonah replied. Victor smiled, then let his expression soften, as if he were trying on a new version of himself and seeing if it fit. You make my nephew better, he said. That matters. After the fundraiser, Matthew and Jonah walked home hand in hand like any other couple, which is to say like every other miracle. They stopped at a corner store for a pint of ice cream and 2 spoons. They sat on the stoop and ate it right out of the carton, because sometimes the simplest happiness is the finest kind. A group of kids on scooters shouted something joyful and rode away like sparrows. When summer leaned in, Matthew asked Jonah to come with him to a family dinner. His mother, Elaine, lived in a house that had been 3 houses once and then had learned to be one. She greeted Jonah like someone she'd been expecting for a while. "I've heard about your cinnamon latte," she said, pulling him into a hug that smelled like lavender in the oven. "It behaves most of the time," Jonah said. "I behave most of the time, too," Elaine said, winking. "We'll get along fine." They did. They talked about books and tomatoes and the right way to fold towels. They washed dishes together, the sound of water and plates a soundtrack for small histories shared and promises made without naming them. After dinner, Elaine showed Jonah a photo album full of Matthew's childhood, his knees perpetually scuffed in summer, and his face as earnest then as it was now. Jonah felt a tenderness grow in him that wasn't just about the man he was falling in love with. It was also about the boy he had been and the woman who had raised him with crossword puzzles and common sense. Autumn came, soft and glowing, the sunset stretching across the river like butter. Jonah organized a Night of Notes at the Senior Center, a simple concert where anyone could play something, read something, or remember something aloud. The room filled with voices. Mrs. Lee played a lullaby her mother had taught her. Mr. Palladino, who grumbled at headlines, read a poem he'd written in 1968, tucked into a shoebox ever since. A teenager from down the block played the piano with an intensity that made everyone stop shifting in their seats. Jonah stood at the back of the room next to Matthew, their shoulders touching lightly, and felt, for a moment, like his life had clicked into place, his work, his people, his love. When it was Matthew's turn, he stood in front of the room and didn't sing or play. He told a story. He told the story of a public library with tall windows and a little boy who learned to steer. He told the story of a rooftop garden where the wind stepped softly. He told the story of a spilled latte and an umbrella that was found and returned. He told the story of a trust that wasn't just a legal document but an act of neighborliness made official. Then he turned, just slightly, toward Jonah and said, "I learned that loving a city and loving a person aren't opposite tasks. They are the same task in different rooms." Evelyn wiped a tear and made a noise like, "Oh!" which translated in any language as approval. Harris clapped first. Jasper whistled. Elaine smiled and raised her eyebrows at Jonah as if to say, "He did good." Later that night, after they had stacked chairs and turned off the lights, Jonah and Matthew sat on the floor of the dim room. Backs against a wall, legs stretched out, shoes off, comfortable and unself-conscious. "I have a confession," Jonah said. "Do I need to call a lawyer?" Matthew asked, joking to soften whatever it was. "No, just your patience," Jonah replied. "Sometimes I still worry I'll wake up and this will all feel temporary." Matthew turned, his expression earnest. "I don't want to make you promises I can't keep," he said. "But I can make this one. I will keep showing up. On the good days and the confusing ones. And when you need to hear it again, I will remind you that we built this slowly on purpose so it would last." Jonah leaned his head on Matthew's shoulder. "Okay," he said. "That's all I needed. You might think this is where the story ends, but it isn't. Because love, the real kind, isn't a finish line. It's a way of walking. So let's keep walking for a moment more." In the years that followed, Matthew continued to work alongside Jasper and Harris, the trio of rich men who had learned to treat wealth like the tool it was. Sometimes they met resistance. Sometimes they made mistakes and apologized. Sometimes they stood up to people they used to stand beside. They started a foundation that didn't put their names on buildings, but quietly paid for childcare during community meetings so parents could attend. They offered grants to small theaters, a stipend to a young violinist who would have otherwise quit to take a third shift at the diner, funds to a mobile clinic that made its schedule around people's lives rather than convenience. Jonah kept the cafe humming. He trained new staff with a tenderness that looked like professionalism from the outside and felt like mentorship from the inside. He added a little shelf where people could leave a book and take a book. He started a Tuesday afternoon letter-writing group with the seniors, where they wrote to soldiers, teachers, and sometimes to their younger selves. He applied for and earned a certificate in nonprofit management because it felt good to learn new words for old instincts. He took a small raise and saved it not for an emergency, but for joy. A weekend train trip to New Orleans to hear music that felt like laughter you could dance to. Their home together took shape the way comfortable houses do, a shelf of mugs that didn't match, a corner with plants that taught them patience, a basket near the front door where they put both their keys. They learned each other's late-night cravings and early morning grumbles. They learned to disagree kindly, to argue with the goal of understanding rather than winning. They learned that housekeeping is not just chores, but a form of respect. They learned to schedule time to be alone and time to be together and time to be with the people who made them who they were. They kept their friends close. Jasper hosted backyard movie nights where everyone brought lawn chairs and sweaters, and someone always burned the popcorn in a way that was somehow reassuring. Harris, older now and moving a little slower, started coming by the senior center more often, as if the circle had finally closed in a way that made sense. He would sit by the door and greet people like a doorman at a glamorous hotel made only of kindness. On their 5th anniversary, a date they never quite agreed upon because relationships like theirs don't begin cleanly on a calendar day, Matthew asked Jonah to meet him after work at the rooftop garden where they had once taught the wind to behave. He had strung a few lights between the planters. Elaine stood at a small table holding a little bouquet of lilac and rosemary. Evelyn wore silver earrings and an expression that could make the moon blush. Teresa brought a clipboard, because of course she did. Harris and Jasper stood side by side, arguing about which pen wrote better vows. Jonah arrived, cheeks flushed with the kind of surprise that tears up from joy rather than shocks down from fear. He looked around and laughed softly. "I should have known you'd beam me up to the clouds," he said to Matthew. "It's a short elevator ride," Matthew replied. "I wanted to ask you something in front of our people. Will you keep doing this with me? The breakfasts and the budgets, the neighborhood meetings, the Tuesday letters, the Sundays where we only say 100 words and it's enough? Will you be exactly who you are and let me love you in all the practical, ordinary ways forever invites?" Jonah didn't make him wait. "Yes," he said. "As long as forever includes dishwashing and taking the bus sometimes. Especially the bus," Matthew said. Best place to hear the city gossip. They exchanged vows they'd written on index cards because they wanted the words to feel like something you could touch. Elaine read a poem. Evelyn said, "Kiss him," with the authority of a woman who had seen enough ceremonies to know when to proceed. They kissed, and it was exactly the right amount of public and private. The city below didn't celebrate because the city has its own schedule, but it made room for the celebration to exist within it. The wind stayed decent. The lights shone. The bench waited for them patiently when they sat together after everyone left. When they returned home, there was a basket on their doorstep, the same one they always used for keys, but now full of letters. On top was a note from the senior center that said, "From your community, with love." They sat on the couch and read them slowly, letter by letter. There were notes from neighbors whose names they didn't know yet, notes from children who had learned to say please at the cafe counter, notes from elders who called them our boys in the way that makes you feel claimed. Some letters said, "Thank you." Some said, "Keep going." One simply said, "You are a very good person to stand next to while the soup is boiling." It was perfect. Years later still, when the tulips returned like brave little flags, Jonah and Matthew walked down the block hand in hand. Older at the edges, still themselves at the center. The senior center window glowed. Inside, Evelyn taught another class, her hair white as sugar. Teresa, retired now, came back once a week to run the crochet group because her hands didn't like not being useful. Harris had a seat with his name on it near the door. Jasper argued about pens with anyone willing to take the bait. Elaine sometimes stopped by with cookies, always leaving with an empty tin, because that is how you know something has truly become home. They paused outside the cafe. Jonah stepped inside for a moment, smelling the cinnamon just to confirm it still behaved. He smiled at the new barista, a young man who had just moved to the city and looked like he was one good conversation away from believing he had made the right decision. Jonah left a note for him on a napkin that said, "You are welcome here. People will remember your kindness longer than your speed. Be patient with yourself." Outside, Matthew waited in the gentle shiver of the wind. Jonah took his hand and nodded toward the lake. "Want to go see if the water has learned any new tricks?" he asked. "It knows us," Matthew replied. "It won't show off." They walked. The city held them. Not because they were extraordinary, though love always feels like that, but because they were ordinary in all the right ways. They did the slow work of care. They asked questions. They gave answers. They accepted help. They gave it. Two rich men used their money like a hammer building a house with many rooms. And one gentle-hearted gay man kept the lights on and the cocoa warm and the door propped open. If you're listening now, if you have lived enough to know that love never stops needing you, I hope this story finds the part of you that knows how to keep going. Maybe you're not rich. Maybe you are. Maybe you're tired. Maybe there's a room somewhere in your city with folding chairs and a stubborn pot of coffee where someone needs you to show up. Maybe you're ready to believe that your life doesn't have to be loud to be a miracle. And if you're Matthew, and if you're Jonah, wherever you are tonight, I hope the wind is kind and the umbrella is sturdy, and the cinnamon behaves, and the city looks at you the way you look at it. Tough, but fair. Proud but willing to learn. Steady and on good nights full of light.